What makes an artist an artist? How do you know if you're an artist? Do you just start calling yourself one, or do you need someone else to label you an artist? These are the questions I've been pondering recently. Yesterday, I went to Taiwan's famous pottery district, Inga, and visited a very talented pottery maker there who specializes in traditional wood-fired pottery. He works 70 hours a week, 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, and has been making pottery for over 10 years. He's apprenticed under famous craftsmen and now works out of Inga, selling his work directly to a retailer who then sells to the public. Every month, he makes decent money, and when I asked him what his dreams for the future were, he didn't really have any. He said that he was very content with where he currently is. He also refuses to call himself an artist. At first, I really struggled with this. What do you mean? The work you make is so beautiful. He prefers the term craftsman, and as he explained, I began to understand. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, the definition of an artist is someone who creates things with great skill and imagination. The definition of a craftsman is a worker skilled in a particular craft. And he, while making very traditional teapots, cups, and mugs, is honing his craft. He doesn't feel the need to make a statement or use lots of his imagination. In fact, he argues that his hands cannot properly make his imagination, and that caused him to live in a valley for a while. A beautiful phrase translated from his Chinese articulation of his feelings. So, does an artist need to make a statement with their art in order to be an artist? Or can an artist create, like a craftsman, without commenting on the world or putting their imagination into it? Or does that make one a craftsman, honing their craft and not adding their twist to it? As I understood his daily schedule and outlook on life, I realized that he and I are not the same. He will probably always be far more skilled than I at pottery, honing in for 70 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, compared to my 10 to 20 hours, 40 weeks a year. But I will always seek to make new things, experimenting with new clays and forms, taking influence from my heritage and ever-changing location. And then I realized that I am both, artist and craftsman. Art and craft are clearly related, and I believe that to create great art, you must put in the reps practicing your craft. Otherwise, you may have much to say, but too small a vocabulary to say it with. The way I see myself, sometimes I am crafting, practicing for the sake of getting better, trying new forms to see what they feel like, and sometimes I am expressing something, as in the case of this shape today. I made my first ever flower vase from a desire to take two long-time loves, flowers and vases, and create something that could stand on its own, a vase that represents a flower in and of itself. But without many hours playing with clay, failing time and time again, making large vases, making small vases, I could never have produced this. By marrying the two, craft and art, I can fulfill my desire to create new things, to make a mark on the world. Maybe I believe that the world needs new ideas only I can create. Ideas like this one, that I'd never seen before I started to make them. And I know that if I continue to make these, they'll only get better, proving that craft really does influence art. I think this articulation is helpful, but maybe it's a silly pursuit to desire a label in this world. Do I need to be called an artist? A ceramicist? I certainly would not call myself a craftsman. Or am I okay foregoing both titles? Society doesn't like it when we don't have labels. It leaves us like scattered ash, difficult to contain and file away like everyone else. What about you? Do you feel like you have or even want a label? Are there labels you've struggled to or don't want to embrace? I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Even though I've made many of these at this point, Everyone is slightly different. They're like flowers in nature. Even on the same tree, different flowers bloom differently. For a long time, I thought that there was some ideal proportion for these flower vases. But then I went to the ceramics exhibition in the V&A in London, and I realized that different potters have been making different vase shapes for generations, and every shape is beautiful. A vase of similar height and width might have a shoulder that rises slightly higher or slightly lower than another piece. The curve from the shoulder connecting to the foot might be slightly different. The foot might be wider or narrower. The length of the neck might be different. And all of these things make for a really unique piece. After trying many different methods for trimming these bottoms, I've found that putting foam into this planter makes it really easy to trim the bottom. The planter has hard sides, so if you don't have some sort of padding like foam or clay, it can dig into the side and leave an impression on the piece. Foam is the fastest way to get something soft and level for the piece to sit on top of. Once the piece is inside the chuck, I also make sure to center it and then secure the chuck to the wheel using these lumps of clay that we call lugs. I press the lugs into the wheel head directly and not into the planter itself, because then it can get really stuck in the planter. This is also good practice for when you're attaching a piece, because if you press into the piece and not into the wheel head, you can dent the piece accidentally. Previously, I had rolled out these coils of clay to prepare them for attaching to the vase. It's important that once you roll out the coils, you keep them moist, or else they can get really hard and crumbly when you start attaching them to the piece. The act of attaching them can take quite some time because you have to secure both the inside and the outside. Otherwise, as you stretch the flower petals, you can get weird ridges and also disconnect the clay from the main body. I try to even out the clay as much as possible here to make stretching out the petals easier. If the clay is too thick at the top and not thick enough at the bottom, it can make the petals really oddly shaped. And this is part of that art as well. No two petals are the same, no flower is the same. So as I work, I'm starting to think about where I might want the petal to stretch up, where it might stretch down, how it might be different than every other one that I've made before. I don't use a mold or even pictures as I make my flower. I let the clay dictate where I feel like the petals should go, some pointing up and some falling down. As I continue to stretch the petals, you'll notice that they get thinner and thinner. I make sure to stretch from the base of the vase itself, from before I added the coils, and pull that clay all the way to the end of the petal. This way I'm compressing the clay even as I'm stretching it out. I do worry sometimes that I'll rip the coil straight off if I pull just the coil part of the petal. As the flower thins, I am more and more careful to not accidentally knock other parts as I work. I am also careful to not let the piece get too wet, or else the flower will flop open in a way that I don't want. So sometimes I let the piece dry, set up a little bit before I continue to stretch out the flower petals. It's impossible to get every flower perfectly smooth and even, but I use a paintbrush to try to smooth out any obvious visible lines that I can see. As I get toward the end of my making, I'll get off the wheel and see the piece from different vantage points. Even though I have a mirror in front of me as I work, it can be helpful to lower myself to see what the piece will look like when viewed at eye level. Every piece looks different, especially when it's asymmetrical like this, so it's important to see it from different angles, or else you might be surprised when the final piece is finished. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.